I arrived at the research station 3 days after the last supply drop, when the mountain silence had already settled into something heavier than absence. The coordinates matched my grandfather's expedition notes from 1987, though the prefabricated cabin hadn't existed then, only the wind-carved stones and the memory of his last radio transmission, still echoing through decades of unanswered questions. My hands trembled as I unpacked his leather journal, its pages brittle with age and secrets, each entry trailing off mid-sentence as if he'd been perpetually interrupted by something he couldn't bring himself to name. The Foundation had hired me to document glacial retreat, to photograph the slow death of ancient ice, but I knew the truth even if I hadn't spoken it aloud. I was here because my grandfather had vanished into these peaks, his expedition declared lost, his work abandoned, and his final words to my grandmother cryptic enough to haunt 3 generations. The air at this altitude tasted thin and metallic, each breath a reminder of how far I'd climbed beyond the realm of simple explanations. Through the cabin's single window, the Himalayas rose like the spine of a sleeping god, their summits disappearing into clouds that seemed less like weather and more like deliberate concealment. I told myself this was about closure, about finishing what he'd started, but as darkness pooled in the valleys below, I felt the weight of inheritance pressing against my chest like a stone. The cabin smelled of kerosene and pine resin, underlaid with something older, a mineral coldness that seeped through the floorboards as if the mountain itself was breathing through the cracks. I arranged my equipment with ritualistic precision. Cameras, laptops, satellite phones, all the modern instruments of verification and proof that my grandfather had never possessed. His journal lay open on the wooden table, and I traced his handwriting with my fingertips, trying to decode the shift that occurred in his entries as he'd climbed higher, his language becoming increasingly poetic, almost devotional. He'd stopped recording measurements in the final week, writing instead about the quality of silence, the way shadows moved against the grain of natural light, the sensation of being watched by something that existed in the margins of perception. I'd read these passages countless times, dismissing them as altitude, sickness, or isolation-induced delusion. But here in this exact landscape, his words took on a different gravity. The scientific method that had governed my entire career suddenly felt like armor I'd worn to protect myself from precisely this kind of knowing. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that might have been geological, ice, grinding against stone, or might have been something breathing in the spaces between peaks. I lit the kerosene lamp as the last daylight bled from the sky, and in its flickering illumination, my grandfather's photograph stared back at me from the journal's inside cover, his eyes holding an expression I'd never understood until now. Not fear, but recognition. The first 2 nights passed in restless half-sleep, my body refusing to surrender fully to unconsciousness at this altitude, my mind caught between the rigorous skepticism of my training and the inheritance of unfinished mystery. I dreamed of ice speaking in my grandfather's voice, of footprints that grew larger the longer I looked at them of my own hands, deliberately destroying photographs of something too significant to capture. During the days, I documented the glacier's retreat with mechanical efficiency, photographing the exposed rock faces like wounds, the meltwater channels like veins bleeding clear, the entire landscape a testimony to irreversible transformation. But I found myself pausing between frames, scanning the ridgelines with an attention that had nothing to do with climate data, waiting for something I couldn't name to reveal itself against the snow. My grandfather's journal mentioned a frozen waterfall 3 kilometers northeast, a place he'd visited repeatedly in his final days, his entries becoming almost prayers directed at the ice itself. The coincidence felt too deliberate to ignore, the same landmark, the same magnetic pull across decades, as if the mountain was extending an invitation that transcended time. I told myself I was being irrational, that grief and altitude were conspiring to make me see patterns where only accident existed. But on the third night, as I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the cabin's ceiling, I heard it, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to rise from the earth itself, words in a language I'd never studied, but that resonated in my chest like a forgotten lullaby. And I knew with absolute certainty that my real work had finally begun. I rose from my sleeping bag without conscious decision, my body moving as if summoned, pulled by threads of sound that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and vibrate directly through bone and blood. The chanting continued, neither growing louder nor fading, existing at a constant threshold between hearing and feeling, each syllable round and ancient as river. Stones. My hands fumbled with my boots in the lamp's dim glow, my scientific mind frantically cataloguing possibilities, local ceremony, audio hallucination, wind patterns creating phonetic illusions, while something deeper and older in my consciousness simply recognized the sound as invitation. I pulled on my thermal layers with shaking fingers, my breath clouding in the cabin's cold air, and realized I was crying without knowing why, tears hot against my frozen cheeks. The chanting held a quality of mourning wrapped around something like welcome, a grief so vast it had calcified into patience over countless years. Through the window, moonlight turned the snow blue, white, and luminous, and I could see nothing moving, no source for the sound that was now indistinguishable from my own heartbeat. My grandfather's journal lay open to a page I didn't remember turning to, and his handwriting seemed to pulse in the lamplight. The mountain speaks in frequencies we've forgotten how to name. I grabbed my headlamp and phone, my fingers hovering over the camera app before something made me leave it dark and pocketed. The door opened with a creak that felt like sacrilege against the chanting's purity, and I stepped into the night, into air so cold it felt solid, into a moment I understood had been waiting for me long before I was born. The chanting shifted the instant I crossed, the threshold becoming directional, leading me away from the cabin toward the northeast ridge where my grandfather had written about the frozen waterfall. My headlamp beam carved a tunnel through darkness, catching snow crystals that hung suspended in air too still for natural weather, each flake refracting light like a tiny prism. The words, if they were words, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from beneath the snow and inside my own chest simultaneously, a resonance that made my teeth ache and my vision blur with inexplicable emotion. I realized I was walking in time to the rhythm, my boots crunching snow in sync with syllables I couldn't quite grasp, couldn't quite separate. From the sound of my own blood moving through my veins, the rational part of my mind screamed warnings about night hiking, about altitude, about the countless ways these mountains could kill someone who wandered into darkness, chasing auditory hallucinations. But my grandfather's journal had prepared me for this, his increasingly mystical entries, a kind of inoculation against pure skepticism, his words a bridge between the world of measurement and the realm of encounter. The chanting carried harmonics that reminded me of throat singing, of Gregorian monks, of sounds I'd heard in documentaries about cultures that maintained unbroken connections to ancient practice. Yet this was none of those things, or it was all of them at once, a linguistic fossil from before languages split into separate rivers. My tears kept freezing on my face, and I had to stop twice to wipe my eyes clear, each pause making me aware of how far I'd walked without conscious navigation, how perfectly I was being guided toward something that waited with the patience of geology. The chanting ceased the moment I crested the ridge, and the silence that replaced it felt like physical pressure, like the moment before an avalanche when the mountain holds its breath. Below me, the frozen waterfall caught moonlight and threw it back transformed. The ice formed into organs and pillars that seemed less like frozen water and more like intentional architecture. My headlamp beam swept across the scene and froze with my breath. massive tracks in the snow, each footprint easily twice the size of my own boot, the stride length suggesting something that walked upright, but belonged to no human proportion. They led from the tree line to the waterfall's base, where a figure sat with its back to me, broad shoulders mantled in white fur that was indistinguishable from snow, except where moonlight caught the subtle movement of breath. It was speaking, the same low, rhythmic cadence as the chanting, but now resolving into language, into English so flawless and unaccented it could have come from any lecturer at any university, except for the underlying tone that held centuries in each syllable. The cognitive dissonance nearly dropped me to my knees. The impossible shape, the human voice, the casual intimacy of the posture as it addressed the frozen water like a mourner at a grave. My grandfather's journal had never mentioned this, had circled around it with metaphor and omission, had protected me from knowing until I could witness it myself. I stood paralyzed on the ridge, caught between the impulse to flee and the deeper knowing that I had not found this moment. It had been waiting, across decades and bloodlines, for me to finally arrive and understand what inheritance truly meant. The creature continued speaking to the ice, words about memory and erasure, about names that had been given to peaks and valleys before humans arrived with their maps and claims of discovery. Its voice carried the weight of witness, of having watched the same waterfall freeze and thaw through centuries of cycles, of knowing the mountain's history not as geology, but as biography. I caught fragments about glaciers that had been rivers of sky-blue light, about snow that had once fallen in patterns that spelled out stories, about the slow forgetting that came with warming, not just the physical melting, but the dissolution of meaning itself. The Yeti, because what else could I call it, what other word, existed in my vocabulary for this impossible being, spoke with a sorrow so profound it felt volcanic, ancient grief expressing itself through perfect grammar and measured breath. My legs finally remembered how to move, carrying me down the slope in small sliding steps, snow hissing under my boots, and I abandoned all pretense of stealth or dignity. I needed to hear more clearly, needed to understand what knowledge could produce this quality of mourning, needed to know if my grandfather had stood in this exact spot and made the same choice to descend toward revelation rather than retreat into the safety of unknowing. The Yeti's massive head tilted slightly, acknowledging my approach, without turning, and it continued speaking about exile and persistence, about being the last keeper of names that no longer matched the shapes they once described, and I realized with vertigo-inducing clarity that I was not discovering a creature. I was being permitted to witness something holy that had decided, for reasons beyond my comprehension, to let itself be seen. I reached the base of the frozen waterfall, with my heart hammering against my ribs like something trying to escape, and still the Yeti did not turn to face me, though its words shifted subtly, acknowledging my presence through inclusion rather than address. It spoke now of individual ice formations, naming them with sounds that predated language as I knew it, then translating those names into English with careful precision: the grandmother's tear, the broken promise, the threshold between mercy and forgetting. Each name came with a story whispered to the frozen cascade, accounts of weather patterns and animal migrations and human pilgrimages that had passed through these valleys before nations drew their borders across the peaks. I stood perhaps 20 feet away, close enough to see how the moonlight caught in its fur, created halos around its massive form, close enough to smell something like high-altitude wind and ancient cedar, close enough to understand that its stillness was not peace but rather the exhausted calm of something that had outlived every context that once gave its existence meaning. The creature's hands, because they were hands however large, however tipped with dark talons, rested on its knees in a posture of meditation or surrender, and I watched those fingers flex slightly as it spoke, emphasizing points in its monologue, with gestures meant for the ice alone. My scientific training screamed about undocumented species and evolutionary impossibilities, while my grandfather's journal burned like coal against my chest through layers of thermal fabric, its presence a reminder that some knowledge could only be inherited, never independently discovered. The Yeti, finally, fell silent, and in that silence I heard the mountain breathing, the creak of ice settling, the whisper of wind across snow, the distant rumble of something shifting deep in the geology beneath our feet. Then it spoke again, and this time the words were clearly meant for me, delivered in that same impossible English, but now facing forward, still addressing the waterfall as if I were simply another feature of the landscape it was cataloguing for the ice's benefit. "The grandson comes," it said, and the words carried no surprise, only acknowledgement of pattern completing itself. "He comes with the same eyes, the same need to understand what should only be felt, the same device in his pocket that promises to transform mystery into proof." My hand moved instinctively to my phone, and I felt the weight of it like accusation, like betrayal of some trust I hadn't known I was inheriting. The creature continued speaking about my grandfather, about the day he had stood in almost this exact spot 3 decades ago, young and certain that the camera in his pack would finally vindicate his theories about high-altitude primates and evolutionary adaptation. He was afraid, the Yeti said, its voice dropping to something barely above a whisper that somehow carried perfect clarity across the frozen air between us. Afraid that seeing me meant his sanity was fracturing, afraid that I was real, afraid that I was not, all fears equally powerful, equally capable of destroying the man he thought himself to be. I realized I was crying again, tears tracking hot down my frozen face, because I recognized that fear like genetic memory, felt it moving through my own nervous system as I stood witness to something that would either unmake me or remake me entirely. The Yeti's shoulders rose and fell with a breath too deep for human lungs, and finally, it turned its massive head to look at me directly, and I understood in that instant why my grandfather's journal had failed to describe this moment. The face defied cataloguing, existed in that uncanny valley where almost human became more disturbing than completely alien, features that suggested primate ancestry, but arranged in proportions that spoke of parallel evolution or ancient divergence or something my vocabulary simply had no framework to contain. But it was the eyes that destroyed me, that took whatever scientific objectivity I'd maintained and burned it down to ash. Eyes dark as mountain shadows, but holding a depth of consciousness that made human intelligence seem like a recently developed feature, still in beta testing. Those eyes carried the weight of witnessing, of having watched civilizations rise in the valleys below and collapse like controlled demolitions, of knowing the mountains before humans named them and understanding they would remain long after the names were forgotten. In that gaze, I saw my grandfather's face reflected back at me across decades, saw the same recognition I was now experiencing, saw the exact moment when curiosity transformed into something closer to religious experience. The Yeti held my stare without aggression or dominance, merely offering itself to be seen with the exhausted generosity of something that had stopped hiding, but never stopped being careful about who truly looked. My hand moved toward my phone again, drawn by instinct and training, and the screaming need for evidence that warred, with the growing understanding that some moments collapsed, under documentation, like quantum states observed into lesser versions of themselves. "Your grandfather took many photographs that day," the Yeti said, its voice now pitched for conversation, and I heard centuries of practice in forming human sounds, of learning language after language as they evolved and spread across the mountains. He filled a camera with images, his hands shaking so badly he was certain none would be clear enough to prove anything. The creature paused, and something that might have been sorrow passed across those impossible features. He returned to his camp and developed them in his portable darkroom, and I waited here by this waterfall knowing he would come back. When he saw what the film contained, My mind raced through the implications that my grandfather's expedition had succeeded, that he had captured proof, that everything I'd been told about his empty-handed return had been carefully constructed mythology. He came back 3 nights later, the Yeti continued, and he carried all his photographs. And he wept as he showed them to me, asking what he should do with evidence that would change everything and destroy something even more important. The creature's gaze softened into something almost tender, almost paternal, and I felt the weight of being watched by something that had known my bloodline across generations, that had witnessed my grandfather's struggle and now watched me inherit the same impossible choice. He fed his photographs to a small fire, one image at a time, and I sat with him until they were all ash scattered on snow, and then I shared with him what I share with so few, the burden of knowing something the world is not ready to believe, and the greater burden of protecting mystery from the violence of proof. The Yeti rose from its seated position with movements that seemed to defy the laws governing mass and gravity, unfolding upward like mist, taking temporary form, and gestured toward a flat expanse of snow beside the frozen waterfall with one massive hand that somehow conveyed both invitation and warning. I moved on legs that felt borrowed from someone braver, crossing that 20 feet of distance that separated us until I stood close enough to feel the heat radiating from its body. An impossible warmth in this altitude, this temperature, as if its metabolism burned on principles unknown to conventional biology. It settled back down and I lowered myself to the snow beside it, not quite close enough to touch, but near enough that I existed within its immediate sphere, breathing air it had just exhaled, occupying space it could reach without effort. The creature turned its attention back to the waterfall, and I understood we were meant to observe together, to witness this frozen cascade as companions in vigil rather than scientist and subject. The ice remembers everything it touches, the Yeti said softly, and I watched its breath materialize in clouds that seemed denser than ordinary vapor, almost tangible enough to read like smoke signals from some ancient fire. Every hand that has cupped water from this stream, every animal that drank here before the cold came, every traveler who paused to rest, the molecules hold those moments like amber preserves insects, unchanging until the thaw releases them back into forgetting. I realized it was teaching me, passing down knowledge that had no place in academic journals or research papers, wisdom that could only be transmitted through proximity and patience and the willingness to accept that understanding sometimes meant abandoning the need to explain. The creature began pointing to specific formations in the frozen waterfall, and as its attention focused on each section, I would have sworn the ice responded, subtle shifts in the way moonlight refracted. Through it, faint sounds like glass chimes in distant rooms, changes so slight I could not be certain whether they were real or produced by my desperate desire to believe in this impossible communion. "There," the Yeti murmured, indicating a cluster of icicles that hung like organ pipes, "is the year the monsoons failed and the valley villages sent children up the mountain to pray for rain, not knowing their prayers were answered before they finished speaking, that weather systems were already shifting across the plateau in patterns that would reach them within days." Its voice carried such tenderness for those frightened children, such sorrow for their unnecessary desperation, and I understood that every human drama played out in these mountains had been witnessed by this being, recorded in memory that spanned generations like time-lapse photography of entire civilizations. "And there," it continued, moving its focus higher, "is the boundary where the ice has retreated 6 meters in the past 5 years alone, where the waterfall used to cascade from before your machines began teaching the atmosphere to trap heat it was never meant to hold." The rebuke in those words was gentle but absolute, not accusation, but rather obituary, the careful documentation of death by degrees. I felt the weight of collective guilt settle across my shoulders like physical mass, the knowledge that my species' comfort had been purchased with the slow murder of these ancient places, and that this being had watched it happen with the helpless horror of someone witnessing inevitable catastrophe in slow motion. The Yeti fell quiet, and in that silence I found myself speaking without planning to, words emerging from some place. Deeper than conscious thought, telling this creature about my grandfather's journal and the way his handwriting deteriorated across its pages, growing shakier and more desperate as he approached the mountains, then suddenly calm and clear in the final entries, the ones written after his encounter. He wrote about loss, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid to disturb whatever fragile connection was forming between us, about how the worst poverty is not lacking things, but lacking the ability to recognize the sacred when it stands before you. The Yeti's head turned slightly toward me, not fully facing, but acknowledging my words with attention that felt like being held in hands large enough to crush or shelter with equal ease. Your grandfather understood what most humans have forgotten, it replied, and I heard something almost like gratitude in its voice, relief that someone remembered, that the message had been passed down, even if imperfectly. That mystery is not a problem to be solved, but rather the natural state of existence, and that the compulsion to illuminate everything is just another form of the fear that has driven your kind to pave over forests and dam rivers and reduce the unmeasurable to data points on graphs. The creature's words carried no anger, only exhausted sadness, and I realized it was sharing its loneliness with me, trusting me, with the weight of being the last of something, of outliving context and purpose and anything resembling home. We sat together in silence that stretched beyond awkwardness into something approaching communion, and I became aware of how our breathing had synchronized without intention, how the rhythm of my heartbeat seemed to align with subtle movements in the creature's massive chest, as if proximity itself was teaching my body to recognize kinship across impossible evolutionary distance. The moon tracked slowly across the sky above us, and shadows shifted across the snow, and gradually I began to perceive patterns in the ice formations that seemed almost linguistic, arrangements of frozen water that suggested meaning without quite resolving into language, symbols that operated below conscious understanding, speaking directly to parts of my nervous system that predated civilization. The Yeti occasionally murmured observations, sometimes in English, sometimes in sounds that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated in my bones, and I found myself responding in kind, not with words, but with attention so complete it became its own form of communication. When my hand unconsciously moved toward my phone again, the creature made a sound like wind through high passes, not quite disapproval, but rather gentle correction, reminding me without judgment that this moment existed in territory cameras could not reach, that the choice to document or to experience fully was becoming more urgent with each passing minute. I let my hand fall back to my lap and felt something in my chest relax that I had not known was clenched, felt myself surrendering to presence in ways my training had specifically designed to prevent, and in that surrender discovered that wonder was not passive reception, but rather active participation in mystery too vast for comprehension, too holy for reduction. The compulsion rose in me like biological imperative, like thirst or the need for oxygen, a hunger that bypassed rational thought and moved my hand toward my pocket with the automaticity of reflex, the journalist's instinct, the researcher's training, the modern human's desperate need to convert experience into evidence. My fingers closed around the phone and drew it out, the screen's blue glow obscene in the moonlit darkness, a rectangle of technological certainty that seemed to violate the sacred geometry of this space we had created through shared silence. The Yeti continued speaking to the ice, maintaining its vigil as though my betrayal was expected, perhaps even necessary, part of some ritual of failure it had witnessed countless times before. I raised the device with hands that shook from more than cold, framing the creature in the viewfinder, watching it resolve. From living mystery into pixels and data, reducible and recordable, and finally provable. The camera struggled to focus in the low light, hunting back and forth, trying to lock onto this impossible subject. And in those seconds of technological hesitation, I felt something tearing inside my chest, some membrane between who I had been and who I was becoming splitting like old paper. When the focus finally caught and the image sharpened on my screen, the Yeti's head turned with terrible slowness, and its eyes, those vast pools of accumulated centuries, fixed not on me, but on the phone itself, regarding the device with an expression of such profound sadness that I felt my throat constrict and tears begin their hot journey down my frozen cheeks. "Ah," the creature said softly, and that single syllable contained libraries of disappointment, millennia of watching humans choose proof over presence, certainty over wonder. "You are your grandfather's blood, but not yet his wisdom." The words landed like blows despite their gentleness, and I stood transfixed, still holding the phone, still recording, unable to move forward into documentation or backward into experience, trapped in the amber of my own indecision. The Yeti rose to its full height, towering above me, but rather than seeming threatening, it appeared instead impossibly vulnerable, exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger, and everything to do with the violence of being seen, captured, converted from subject to object by the cold mechanical eye of technology. "Do you understand what that device does?" it asked, gesturing toward my phone with one massive hand. "Not its technical function. I know you understand the mechanics of light and silicon and storage. But do you comprehend what it does to mystery, the way it collapses possibility into single interpretations, transforms the numinous into the merely unusual?" I wanted to lower the phone, to stop recording, but my hands would not obey, locked in position by forces I could not name. Ambition, fear, the desperate need to prove to myself and others that I had not imagined this, that my sanity remained intact, that the impossible had granted me audience, and I possessed evidence to prove it. The recording continued, seconds accumulating into damning documentation, and with each moment that passed, I felt the experience itself diminishing, flattening, becoming something that happened to me rather than something I participated in. The difference between dancing and watching footage of dancers, between tasting fruit and reading its nutritional analysis. The Yeti moved closer, closing the distance between us with 2 enormous steps, and suddenly filled my phone's frame entirely, its face occupying the screen in terrifying detail, the silver-white fur that seemed to absorb rather than reflect moonlight, the eyes that held depths no camera could capture, the mouth that shaped English words despite anatomy that should have made human speech impossible. "Your grandfather stood exactly where you stand now," it said, and I realized with shock that it was speaking not to me, but to the camera, addressing future viewers, performing its own extinction for whatever audience might eventually witness this footage. He also raised his camera, also felt the pull of proof stronger than the call of presence, also believed that documentation would somehow validate experience that needed no validation. Beyond its own occurrence, the creature's voice carried no accusation, only the tired patience of a teacher repeating lessons that never quite take root, planting seeds in soil too poisoned by modernity to sustain growth. And when he watched the footage later, alone in his tent, do you know what he saw? The Yeti paused, letting the question hang between us like the frozen breath clouds that dissipated into darkness. Nothing. Static and distortion and occasional shapes that could have been anything. Bare man in costume, tricks of light and shadow. Because mystery protects itself, collapses its own wave function when observed with instruments designed to eliminate uncertainty. And what your machines record is only the absence where wonder use. The Yeti's words hung in the frozen air like a sentence awaiting execution. and I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding, tectonic plates of certainty grinding against each other until the landscape of everything I believed cracked and reformed into new and terrible configurations. Some truths collapse under the weight of evidence, it continued, its voice acquiring texture and depth that seemed to resonate not just in my ears, but in my bones, my blood, the spaces between thoughts where instinct dwells. Your cameras and sensors and measuring devices are designed to capture what can be verified, replicated, proven beyond doubt. But there are phenomena that exist only in the spaces doubt creates, mysteries that breathe in the oxygen of uncertainty and suffocate when exposed to the harsh atmosphere of documentation. The creature gestured toward the mountains surrounding us, peaks that jutted into the star-scattered sky like broken teeth, ancient and eroding and slowly, inexorably disappearing as the climate shifted and the glaciers retreated into myth. "These mountains are forgetting their own names," it said with such profound grief that I felt my chest constrict in sympathetic anguish. "The ice holds memory, you see, in its layers and depths, in the air bubbles trapped for millennia, in the weight of accumulated winters pressing stories into crystal and cold. But as the ice melts, so too does the memory, and with it goes the ability of this place to remember what it once was, what walked here, what called these peaks home before your kind arrived with your maps and measurements and need to make everything knowable, controllable, owned." I watched through the phone's screen as the Yeti's expression shifted into something I could not initially name, emotion too complex for the simple categories humans use to organize feeling. And then I recognized it. Not sadness exactly, not anger, but something closer to resignation mixed with a species of compassion that felt almost unbearable in its vastness. "Your grandfather understood this before he vanished into the peaks," the creature said, and those words detonated inside my skull like grenades, scattering fragments of implication that I scrambled to collect and assemble into coherent meaning. Vanished, not died, not was lost, but vanished as though he had chosen dissolution over return, elected to become one more mystery rather than return to a world that would demand explanations for experiences that transcended explanation. The Yeti moved closer still, until I could feel the heat radiating from its massive body, warmth that seemed impossible given the sub-zero temperatures, as though it generated its own climate through sheer presence, maintained its own ecosystem independent of surrounding conditions. He stood where you stand, held his camera as you hold yours, and faced the same choice you face now, proof or preservation, evidence or enchantment, the certainty that kills wonder or the wonder that makes life worth the uncertainty of living it. Its eyes held mine through the screen, and I felt the absurdity and tragedy of that mediation, experiencing this profound moment filtered through technology, watching life through the window of documentation rather than simply living it directly. "He recorded everything just as you are doing," the Yeti continued, and I heard in its voice the accumulated weariness of having told this story before, perhaps many times, to many seekers who came with their devices and their desperate need for validation. Hours of footage, me speaking, moving, existing in ways that should have been impossible according to your science, irrefutable proof that would have revolutionized cryptozoology, anthropology, perhaps even philosophy itself, by confirming that the world still held mysteries your civilization had not catalogued and conquered. The creature paused, letting that possibility bloom fully in my imagination. The fame, the validation, the way such evidence would have rewritten textbooks and elevated my grandfather into the pantheon of great discoverers, men whose names echo through history because they brought darkness into light. But he watched the footage in his tent that night, this man who was your blood and your legacy, and he wept. The Yeti said softly, and I realized with shock that I was weeping too, tears streaming freely now, freezing in tracks down my face like tiny glaciers forming their own geography of grief on my skin. He wept because he saw what the camera had done, reduced mystery to mere zoology, transformed the numinous into the simply unusual, taken something holy and made it hollow through the violence of documentation. The Yeti's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout, each word falling into the silence like stones into a well, and I listened for the splash that would tell me how deep this revelation went. Your grandfather sat with that footage for 3 days, barely eating, not sleeping, watching it over and over, as though repetition might resolve the contradiction he felt tearing him apart from the inside, it continued, and I could picture him there in his tent with the mountains pressing in from all sides, the weight of decision crushing him just as it crushed me now. He understood that releasing this evidence would prove his claims, validate his years of searching, silence every skeptic who had mocked his obsession, but it would also destroy the very thing he had spent his life seeking, because wonder cannot survive certainty, and mystery dies the moment it becomes merely fact. The creature's massive hand moved through the air in a gesture that seemed almost priestly, a benediction or perhaps an absolution for a choice already made decades ago. He came to me on the 4th day, here at this waterfall, and he brought the camera with him, the footage still intact, and he asked me a question that revealed he had understood everything. He asked if the world needed more facts or more faith, more evidence or more enchantment, more proof of mysteries solved, or more permission to believe in mysteries that remain gloriously, necessarily unsolved. I watched its face through my phone's screen and saw something profound there, respect maybe, or recognition of sacrifice, the acknowledgement that passes between those who have chosen difficulty over convenience, preservation over possession. I told him what I tell you now, that the choice could only be his, that I would not make it for him, because the weight of it must be carried by the one who decides, and that weight becomes either burden or blessing, depending on the spirit of the chooser. The wind rose around us, carrying snow that stung exposed skin and blurred the boundary between earth and sky, and the Yeti's voice wove through it like a thread of warmth, through killing cold. He deleted the footage there in front of me, file by file, hour by hour of documentation disappearing into digital void, and with each deletion he spoke aloud what he was surrendering: recognition, validation, legacy, proof, naming each sacrifice as it dissolved into nothing. I felt my breath catch as I imagined that moment. The deliberate destruction of what would have been the most important scientific documentation of the century, erased not through accident or loss, but through conscious, agonizing choice. But as the evidence disappeared, I watched something else appear in him, something the camera had obscured while it was present, a kind of peace, a settling into acceptance that transcended the need for external validation because it was rooted in internal truth, the knowledge that he had witnessed something genuine regardless of whether anyone else believed him. The Yeti's eyes remained locked on mine through the mediation of the screen, and I felt the terrible intimacy of that gaze, the way it seemed to see not just my face, but the architecture of my soul, the framework of belief and doubt that held my identity together. He told me afterward that the footage had felt like a kind of violation, that watching himself watching me had revealed the distance documentation creates, the way recording an experience prevents full participation in it, how the need to capture proof pulls you out of presence and into performance. The creature shifted its weight, and I heard the ice beneath it groan in response, a sound like the earth itself commenting on this testimony. He said that deleting it felt like returning something stolen, giving back what he had taken, restoring balance to an exchange that had been made unequal by his need to prove, rather than simply perceive, to document, rather than simply be. After the deletion was complete, after every file had been consigned to permanent absence, your grandfather sat in the snow and sobbed with a combination of grief and relief I have witnessed in only a handful of humans, the Yeti said. and its voice carried such tenderness that I felt my own throat constrict in response. Grief for what he had willingly destroyed, for the fame and recognition he would never claim, for the proof he could never show to those who had doubted his sanity over the years of searching, but relief too, profound and liberating, because he no longer carried the burden of decision, because he had chosen mystery over mastery, and in doing so had freed himself from the tyranny of having to prove his own experience valid to those who were not present for it. I watched through my screen as the creature reached out one massive hand toward me, not threatening but offering, palm up in a gesture of invitation, or perhaps supplication. He asked me what would happen now, whether I would disappear or remain, whether this encounter would be his last, or if he might see me again in these mountains he loved so desperately, and I told him truth that I now tell you. The Yeti rose then with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive, and gestured for me to follow as it moved away from the frozen waterfall toward a section of rock face I had passed without noticing anything unusual. My phone still recorded, still bore witness to every step I took through snow that had suddenly grown deeper, heavier, as though the mountain itself sought to slow my approach to whatever revelation waited. Ahead, the creature pressed one enormous hand against what appeared to be solid stone, and the rock shifted with a grinding whisper that spoke of mechanisms older than any human engineering, revealing an opening just wide enough for its broad shoulders to pass through. I hesitated at that threshold, suddenly aware that crossing it would change everything, that whatever lay beyond that darkness would demand something from me I might not be able to give. But the Yeti paused and looked back with eyes that held such profound understanding of my terror that I felt simultaneously exposed and protected. Your grandfather stood exactly where you stand now, feeling exactly what you feel, the fear of knowledge, the weight of witness, the terrible gravity of transformation. It said softly, and something in those words steadied me enough to step forward into shadow that swallowed the meager daylight behind me. My phone's screen provided the only illumination as I moved deeper into the mountain, following the massive form ahead of me through passages that felt less like cave and more like cathedral, carved by intention rather than erosion. The darkness pressed close, but not oppressive, intimate rather than threatening, as though the mountain held me gently in its ancient palm while leading me toward something it had protected for longer than my species had possessed language. My breath came quick and shallow, visible in the cold air, each exhalation a small ghost that dispersed into the greater darkness. And I thought about all the breaths that had been exhaled in this space before mine, all the witnesses who had walked this same path toward revelation. Then the passage opened into a chamber, and the Yeti stepped aside so I could see, and what I saw drove all breath from my lungs in a gasp that echoed off stone walls and returned to me transformed into something like a sob. The cave stretched larger than my phone's light could fully illuminate, but what the glow revealed stole coherence from my thoughts and replaced it with pure, overwhelming wonder. Hundreds of objects arranged with careful reverence across every surface, each one placed with the kind of attention that transforms ordinary things into offerings, artifacts into relics. I saw cameras of every era from daguerreotype to digital, their lenses pointed toward nothing now, but still holding the memory of what they had been prevented from capturing. Journals and notebooks stacked in careful piles, their pages filled with writing in dozens of languages, testimonies never published, evidence never submitted, recording devices from cylinder to cassette to solid state, each one silenced before it could speak its truth to a world that would have weaponized wonder into mere spectacle. There were older things too, objects that predated the age of mechanical documentation, paintings on bark and hide, sculptures carved from mountain stone, weavings that depicted encounters in thread and dye, all of them representations created and then surrendered, proof offered and then relinquished. I moved deeper into the chamber with legs that barely supported my weight, my phone's camera capturing what my mind struggled to process, and I saw patterns in the arrangement, saw how objects were grouped not by type, but by something else, some organizing principle that suggested relationship, connection, perhaps even conversation between artifacts separated by centuries. Each object seemed to pulse with the weight of decision it represented, the moment when its creator had chosen mystery over certainty, faith over evidence, the sacred preservation of wonder over the secular satisfaction of proof validated. Every person who has encountered me and understood the choice has left something here, the Yeti said from behind me, its voice filling the chamber with resonance that made the object seem to vibrate in response. And I realized I was crying, though I couldn't remember when the tears had started. Not as payment or exchange, but as acknowledgement, a physical manifestation of what they chose to surrender and what they chose to preserve, documentation transformed from evidence into offering, from proof into prayer. I turned to face it and saw that my phone's screen illuminated its face from below, creating shadows that made it look simultaneously ancient and newborn, terrible and tender, wholly other and profoundly familiar. "Your grandfather's camera is here," the device he used to capture and then delete our meeting, placed among the others not as failure but as testament, and beside it he left something more precious than any footage, his journal, the one he kept throughout his final expedition, written not for publication, but for truth, not for others, but for himself, not for proof, but for processing. The creature moved through the chamber with steps that somehow avoided disturbing any of the carefully arranged objects, and I followed with my phone, still recording, still documenting this impossible testimony, still carrying the burden and blessing of witness. He left it for whoever might come after him, whoever might face the same choice he faced, and he left it open to a specific page, the final entry he made before he walked into these mountains and chose not to return to the world that demanded his wonder, fit their frameworks of fact. The Yeti reached a small alcove I had not noticed, and there, on a natural shelf of stone, sat a leather journal I recognized from childhood photographs, my grandfather's hand visible in the wear patterns on its cover, and beside it an empty space exactly the size of the phone trembling in my grip. I reached for the journal with my free hand, while my recording hand remained steady, trained through years of documentation to maintain focus, even when my heart attempted to tear itself apart, and I opened it to the marked page, with fingers that had gone, numb from cold or shock, or the weight of what this moment demanded. My grandfather's handwriting filled the page in ink that had faded but not disappeared, words written in steady script that revealed no hesitation, no doubt, only the calm certainty of someone who had wrestled with decision and emerged, transformed by the struggle. "I have seen what I came to see, found what I spent my life seeking, and now I understand that the search was always more sacred than the finding, the mystery more precious than its solution," the entry began, and I felt those words resonate in the deepest part of my chest, where grief and wonder occupied the same space. "The world will say I failed, that I ventured into these mountains and found nothing, that my obsession consumed me and left no legacy but cautionary tale. And I accept this judgment because the truth I carry needs no external validation, because wonder witnessed is its own reward, because some mysteries must remain holy precisely because they resist reduction to evidence and explanation." My vision blurred as tears refracted the phone's light into fractured spectra, but I kept reading, kept bearing witness to my grandfather's final testimony. "I leave this journal for whoever follows, whoever feels called to these peaks by the same hunger that called me, and I leave it with this blessing and this burden, that you might choose as I have chosen, that you might understand as I now understand, that you might surrender proof to preserve something more valuable than validation." The final lines seemed to glow with their own light. Or perhaps that was just the tears magnifying my phone's screen into something incandescent. Some mysteries must remain holy, not because we lack courage to expose them, but because we possess wisdom to protect them. And in that protection, we ourselves are transformed from seekers of evidence into guardians of wonder. I stood in that cathedral of surrendered certainties with my grandfather's journal in one hand and my phone in the other, the device still recording, still capturing every word and image, still carrying the possibility of validation that would transform my life and career, but perhaps destroy something infinitely more precious. The Yeti watched me with those eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of centuries, patient as only something that has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations can be patient, and I understood that this was the moment, that everything before had been prologue to this single crushing decision that would define not just my relationship to this encounter, but to mystery itself. My finger hovered over the delete button, trembling with the knowledge of what that simple gesture would cost and what it would preserve, and I thought about my grandfather standing in this exact spot decades ago, feeling this same terrible gravity, wrestling with this same impossible choice. The weight of it compressed my chest until breathing became deliberate rather than automatic, and I realized that this was what transformation felt like, not enlightenment's sudden illumination, but pressures, slow reconstruction, the self crushed and reformed by forces too vast to resist. I could share this, I whispered, my voice breaking on the words, fracturing into fragments that echoed off stone walls and returned to me distorted, strange, barely recognizable. I could show the world, prove everything, vindicate my grandfather's obsession and my own, make his name legendary and secure my own legacy in the process. The Yeti nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of what I said without judgment, without trying to influence my choice, simply bearing witness to my struggle, as it had borne witness to so many others before me. "You could," it agreed, and something in that simple affirmation paradoxically made the choice harder rather than easier, because there was no manipulation here, no coercion, just the pure, terrible freedom of decision made without external pressure or internal certainty. The footage would convince many, perhaps even most. The evidence is clear, undeniable, the kind of documentation that reshapes understanding and rewrites textbooks and generates careers and conferences and cascading consequences you cannot begin to predict. It moved closer until I could see individual hairs in its frost-white coat, each one seeming to hold light rather than reflect it. And I understood I was looking at something that existed in relationship to reality differently than I did, something that occupied space without being entirely constrained by it. But you must understand what would be lost in that sharing, not just my privacy or safety, though those would certainly be compromised, but something more fundamental, something that belongs not to me, but to everyone who still possesses the capacity for wonder unmarred. By certainty's corrosion, the creature's voice dropped lower, became almost intimate, as though speaking secrets meant only for me, despite the phone still recording between us. Mystery is not ignorance waiting to be corrected, but a kind of knowledge that transcends fact, a way of relating to existence that honors what cannot be reduced to evidence and explanation. And when that mystery collapses under documentation's weight, something irreplaceable dies in those who witness its death. I understood then what my grandfather had understood, felt in my bones what he must have felt. That this was not about protecting the Yeti, but about protecting something in myself and in humanity that needed mystery the way lungs need air. The decision clarified not suddenly but gradually, like dawn arriving so slowly you cannot identify the moment darkness becomes light, and I felt my thumb move toward the delete button with a certainty that bypassed doubt and connected directly to some deeper knowing I had not possessed before entering this chamber. "My grandfather chose wisely," I said, my voice steadier now, tears still falling but no longer from confusion or conflict, instead from the profound relief of finally understanding what I needed to do, who I needed to become. He understood that some truths are too precious to expose, that wonder witnessed but not weaponized into proof is its own form of knowledge, its own kind of truth. The Yeti's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile, or might have been the play of shadow and light across features not designed for human interpretation. And I felt, rather than heard, its approval, its recognition that another witness had become another guardian. I came here looking for answers, for validation, for something to fill the absence my grandfather left behind. But what I found was the answer he discovered, that the absence itself was sacred, that the unfilled space was the gift, that mystery preserved is legacy perfected. My finger touched the screen and the recording stopped, and then with 3 more deliberate gestures I deleted the footage completely, watching the progress bar drain away until nothing remained except the memory of what I had witnessed, unprovable and therefore incorruptible. The phone felt lighter immediately, as though the deleted footage had possessed literal weight, and I placed it gently on the stone shelf beside my grandfather's journal, 2 artifacts of surrender arranged side by side, testimony to choices separated by decades but united by understanding. The Yeti placed one massive hand on my shoulder with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so powerful, and I felt through that touch the continuation of something ancient, a tradition of witnessing and protecting that stretched back through time to the first humans who recognized that some experiences transcended documentation. "You carry your grandfather's wisdom now," it said quietly, and I knew this was farewell, that our encounter had reached its conclusion, that what came next would be the rest of my life lived in relationship to this moment, defined not by what I could prove, but by what I chose to protect. When you descend from these mountains, you will carry no evidence, but you will carry everything that matters, the knowledge that mystery persists, that wonder survives, that in a world increasingly mapped and measured and explained, there remain experiences that resist reduction to data and exist instead in the unmappable territory of transformed understanding. I nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that closed my throat, and understood that this silence was more eloquent than any words I might have managed, that wordlessness was its own form of testimony. The creature turned and moved toward the passage that led deeper into the mountain rather than out toward daylight, and I understood it was offering me privacy for my exit, allowing me to leave without the burden of wondering if it watched my departure. Before it disappeared completely into darkness, it paused and looked back one final time, and in that glance I saw recognition and respect, and something like gratitude, acknowledgement that the tradition continued, that another guardian had been born from the crucible of choice, that mystery would survive another generation, because I had found the courage to surrender certainty in exchange for wonder's preservation. I descended from the research station 3 days later, with nothing to show for my expedition except my grandfather's journal and a transformation invisible to everyone who greeted me at base camp with questions about what I had found, what I had documented, whether the trip had been worth the difficulty and expense. I told them the weather had been too severe for proper research, that equipment failures had corrupted most of my data, that I would need to return another season with better preparation. Lies that tasted like ash, but protected something more valuable than my reputation or career prospects. On the flight back to civilization, I read my grandfather's journal cover to cover, finally understanding entries that had seemed cryptic or evasive when I first inherited the worn leather volume years ago, recognizing now that his careful avoidance of specifics had been deliberate protection rather than frustrating vagueness. He had written around the truth rather than through it, creating a map of negative space that pointed toward mystery without violating its boundaries. And I understood that I would do the same, that my own documentation of this expedition would follow his template of sacred omission. The other passengers slept or watched movies or worked on laptops while I sat with that journal open to its final entry. Those 6 words that had once seemed like defeat but now read like victory. Some mysteries must remain holy, and I felt connected to my grandfather across the barrier of death in ways I had never achieved while he lived. He had known I would follow his path eventually, had left the journal as breadcrumb and blessing, trusting that when I finally encountered what he had encountered, I would make the choice he had made, that the legacy he truly wanted to pass down was not evidence but ethics, not proof but protection. The weeks that followed were harder than I had anticipated, a constant navigation between what I knew and what I could acknowledge, between private transformation and public expectation. Colleagues asked about my expedition with polite interest that barely masked disappointment when I admitted I had no breakthrough findings, no dramatic discoveries, nothing that would justify the funding or advance the research or generate the publications that academic careers require. I watched their enthusiasm drain as I spoke in careful generalities, saw the moment when I shifted in their perception from promising researcher to failed opportunity, and I had to consciously resist the urge to defend myself with the truth that would simultaneously vindicate and destroy me. Friends noticed something different in me, but could not identify what had changed, commenting that I seemed distant or distracted or somehow fundamentally altered in ways they could not. Articulate, but clearly sensed. I tried to explain that the mountains had affected me profoundly, that solitude and altitude had provided perspective on priorities, that I was reconsidering my relationship to career and ambition, all technically true, but frustratingly incomplete, sketches of transformation rather than its full portrait. At night, I would lie awake, remembering the cave and the creature and the choice, playing the encounter over in memory with perfect clarity, grateful that mental recollection required no external validation, that I could revisit the experience without needing anyone else to confirm or witness or believe. My grandfather's journal became my constant companion, a talisman I touched throughout the day, as though physical contact could channel his certainty into my own wavering commitment. And gradually, over weeks and months, the choice I had made stopped feeling like sacrifice and began feeling like liberation. A year later, I returned to the Himalayas, not as researcher but as guide, leading small groups who came seeking not answers but experiences, people who wanted to encounter the mountains on their own terms rather than through the mediating lens of scientific documentation. I discovered I had a gift for this work, an ability to help others open themselves to mystery without needing to capture or categorize it, and I realized this was my true vocation, the calling I had been preparing for without knowing through all my years of academic training. We would camp beneath stars so dense they seemed like snow falling upward, and I would tell stories around fires that cast shadows stretching into darkness, tales of the mountains and their secrets, never mentioning the Yeti directly, but somehow always circling toward that ineffable presence. Some clients left disappointed that we had not found anything concrete, but others departed transformed in ways they could not quite articulate, carrying home the same invisible gift I had received, the knowledge that mystery persisted, that wonder survived, that the world still harbored experiences beyond explanation's reach. I would occasionally glimpse tracks too large to be human, or hear that low, rhythmic chanting carried on wind from peaks no expedition could access, and I would smile and say nothing and feel my grandfather's presence like a hand on my shoulder, his approval radiating across whatever boundary separates the living from the dead. The phone I had carried to that cave still worked perfectly, but I never used it for photography anymore, preferring to witness experiences directly rather than through screens. And when people asked why I traveled without documenting my journeys, I would simply say that some moments were too precious to preserve. That memory, unmediated, was its own form of immortality. In my apartment, I keep a small shrine that would mean nothing to anyone else, but contains everything that matters to me. My grandfather's journal open to that final entry, a single white hair too coarse to be human that I found on my jacket after descending from the cave, a photograph of my grandfather, young and vital, standing before mountains that still held their glaciers and their secrets. Sometimes late at night I light a candle before this arrangement and sit in silence, not praying exactly, but communing with something larger than myself, acknowledging my place in a tradition of guardians who chose protection over proof, wonder over career, mystery over certainty's comfortable tyranny. I think about all the others who must have made this choice throughout centuries, the cave full of surrendered tokens, representing lives redirected by a single encounter, and I feel part of something vast and ancient and vitally important, in an age that increasingly treats mystery as problem rather than gift. When I finally write my own account of that expedition, not for publication but for whoever might inherit my grandfather's journal after I am gone, I will end with the same 6 words he used, passing down the wisdom he passed to me, trusting that the legacy of protection will continue through whoever is brave enough to follow our path into those mountains, and wise enough to descend with empty hands and full hearts, carrying no evidence except the eternal testimony of transformation, witnessed but never weaponized, experienced but never exposed, forever sacred, because forever unproven. What would you sacrifice to protect the world's remaining mysteries? Subscribe to hear more. Stories that live in the space between knowing and proving.